wake before the sun touches the plain. The air is already warm, not the warmth of comfort, but the dense, pressing warmth of a valley that never fully cools. The mud walls around you still carry the heat from yesterday. The floor under your feet is packed earth, smooth from years of the same feet walking the same path before dawn. Somewhere outside, a goat pulls at a rope. Further away, something larger moves. Animals being driven toward water, toward work, toward the day that has already started, without asking your permission. You step outside. The sky above the plain is pale gray, turning amber. And there, rising from the flat land, like something that does not belong to the earth at all, is the Ziggurat. Its mass is impossible to ignore. 7 terraces stacked toward a sky that still holds the last few stars. Its surface is dark brick, dried hard in the sun of 100 seasons. Torches burn at its upper levels. Smoke drifts down. Even from here you can smell the offerings, barley, oil, animal fat, carried upward by priests who have been awake longer than you. You know what that smell means. It means the gods are being fed before the people are. And you understand, without needing anyone to explain it, that this is not cruelty. This is the correct order of things. The Ziggurat is not decoration. It is not a tomb. It is the engine that keeps the world running. The place where divine authority is managed, stored, and redistributed. And today, like every day, you are one of the bodies that feeds that engine. The city around you is already alive. Weavers moving toward workshops, water carriers balancing clay jars on their shoulders, children being sent in the direction of the temple granary with small parcels tucked under their arms. The day has a structure. That structure has your name somewhere inside it. You just have to find your place in it before someone finds you first. The Ziggurat worked. For the priests at its summit, for the administrators who controlled its grain stores, for the kings whose authority it sanctified, for everyone else, the laborers, the weavers, the water carriers, the farmers who handed over their harvest at the gate. It was a system of managed survival. You were not a citizen. You were a component. And the difference was everything. Mesopotamia, in the early 2nd millennium BCE, is one of the most organized societies that has ever existed. That organization is not accidental. It is architectural. The Ziggurat complex is not just a temple. It is simultaneously a warehouse, a court, a labor bureau, a granary, and a theological institution. Every resource that enters the city passes through or is accounted for by this structure. Every obligation a person carries toward the gods, toward the king, toward the community, is tracked in clay. You exist inside a hierarchy with no ambiguity. At the top, the king, who is the earthly representative of the city's patron deity. Below him, a class of high priests and temple administrators who manage the divine economy, allocating land, distributing rations, recording debts, assigning corvée labor. Below them, a middle tier of scribes, overseers, skilled craftsmen, and merchants. And then there is the tier where most people live. The mushkanum, the common laborer, the person who owns very little and owes a great deal. You cannot leave the city without permission. You cannot change your labor assignment without approval. You cannot withhold the portion of your harvest that belongs to the temple. And the temple always knows what that portion is, because surveyors measured your field at planting, and scribes recorded the expected yield before the grain was even ripe. The administrative machine has been watching you since before you produced anything. This is not tyranny in the modern sense. There is no secret police, no random terror. The system is predictable, which in some ways is worse. You know exactly what is expected. You know exactly what happens if you fail to deliver. And you know that appealing to a higher power means appealing to the same institution that is making the demand in the first place. What the temple gives in return is real. Access to water through managed irrigation canals, protection behind city walls, rations during drought, work during flood. You are not being robbed. You are in a contract. The terms of the contract were written before you were born, and no one asked if you agreed. But the contract holds, and for now, it keeps you alive. Now you understand where you stand. The question is, what the next 24 hours will cost your body to remain there. The labor itself begins at dawn and does not have a fixed end. Your assignment today is canal maintenance. One of the most critical and most brutal forms of corvée work the temple administers. The irrigation network that waters the fields is not a natural feature of this landscape. It was built by human hands across generations, and it requires constant human hands to survive. Silt accumulates, banks erode, gates jam with debris. If the canals fail, the harvest fails. If the harvest fails, everything else follows. You arrive at the worksite with a wooden tool, something between a hoe and a shovel, worn smooth where thousands of hands have gripped it before yours. The mud is dense and heavy, the kind that pulls at your ankles and holds the smell of stagnant water deep inside it. You dig, you carry, you dump, you return and dig again. There is no technique that makes this easier. There is only repetition. Skeletal remains examined from burial sites in this region show the physical cost of this work written directly into bone, compressed vertebrae, worn joint surfaces, healed fractures in the hands and lower spine that indicate years of heavy repetitive labor beginning in adolescence. The body was not spared. It was used systematically and deliberately because the alternative, a failed canal, a dry field, a city without grain, was something the temple could not afford. The overseers move along the work line. They carry tablets. They record how much you moved, whether you were present, whether you fulfilled your quota. Missing a day requires justification. Persistent absence results in debt. Not imprisonment, but the kind of institutional debt that follows you, reduces your ration allocation, and passes in some cases to your children. The work is not voluntary, but it is also not random. It is precisely calculated, and that precision is what makes it inescapable. By midday, the sun over the plain is not a comfort. It is a pressure. You drink from the same water you are digging beside. You do not think about what else has been in that water. The ration you receive at the end of a workday is not wages. It is an allocation. There is a difference. Wages imply negotiation. An allocation implies that someone already decided what your body needs to function and has given you exactly that. No more, no less, and only as long as you remain useful to the system that distributes it. Temple ration records from this period survive on clay tablets, one of the most detailed administrative archives of the ancient world. They show exactly what a common laborer received: a fixed quantity of barley, a smaller measure of oil, occasional access to fish or dried vegetables. The calculation was precise, enough to work, not enough to accumulate, certainly not enough to become independent of the system that issued the ration in the first place. The barley is your everything. You grind it, you boil it, you ferment it into a thick, sour beer that is easier to digest than the grain itself and safer than standing water. The beer is not recreation, it is nutrition. A worker without beer in this climate, doing this work, does not last long. Temple breweries operate at an industrial scale precisely because the beer is part of what keeps the labor force functional. But the ration assumes a working adult. Children receive smaller portions. The elderly receive smaller portions, if they receive anything at all. A sick worker who cannot report to the worksite may have their allocation suspended. This is not policy born of malice. It is efficiency. The system feeds what produces. What does not produce becomes a burden the system does not recognize. A family with a sick member faces a gap in its allocation that no institution is designed to close. You fill that gap by eating less yourself, by borrowing grain from a neighbor who is also eating less, by hoping the person recovers before the debt compounds. Most of the time, they recover. Some of the time, they do not. But even if the ration holds, the body carries its own risks, ones that no administrator has recorded and no priest has prayed against. The canal water you drank at midday is the same water that runs past the waste from the animal pens at the edge of the residential quarter. You did not think about this when you drank it. You have been drinking it your entire life. Everyone you know drinks it. No one connects the drinking to the dying. Intestinal disease is the constant background noise of life in this valley. Not the dramatic plague that kills entire cities overnight, that comes later in other episodes, but the slow, grinding erosion of gut infections, parasitic worms, contaminated food, and accumulated nutritional deficiency. Skeletal remains from this period show high rates of childhood anemia and growth interruption. Many of the bodies show evidence of repeated infection, visible in the bone as Harris lines. Horizontal striations in the long bones where growth stopped during illness and restarted after recovery. The body records what the person survived. It also records what they never fully recovered from. You do not have the vocabulary for what is killing people around you. You have the vocabulary of the gods, the wrath of a deity, the withdrawal of divine protection, the consequence of ritual impurity. When someone falls ill, the response is theological before it is practical. A physician-priest is consulted. Incantations are performed. Herbal treatments are administered. Some of them work, because plants from this valley contain real medicinal compounds that generations of empirical observation discovered without ever naming as science. Many of them do not work. Childbirth is where the combination of contamination, exhaustion, and inadequate nutrition becomes most lethal. Women who have been carrying heavy loads, eating insufficient protein, and drinking contaminated water for years arrive at labor already depleted. Complications are frequent. Recovery is slow. The infant mortality rate embedded in the archaeological record here is not shocking by ancient standards. That is exactly the problem. The death of children is ordinary enough to have generated protective incantation texts in large quantities. Formulaic prayers scratched onto clay, buried beneath thresholds, placed near sleeping children. The magic was abundant because the danger was constant. There is something that happens inside this world, though, that no one in it would frame as dangerous, because it comes from the one institution everyone depends on. The Ziggurat is the source of safety. Everyone in this city believes this. The god who lives at its summit controls the water, the harvest, the fate of the city in war. The priests who serve that god are intermediaries, not authorities. The rations that come from the temple storehouses are divine provision, not bureaucratic distribution. This is not metaphor. It is the structural reality of how this society understands itself and organizes its obligations. And here is what no one sees. The Ziggurat is also the source of the debt that will outlive most of the people carrying it. Temple records from this period, from Nippur, from Ur, from Lagash, document a credit system that operated alongside the ration system. In bad years, when the harvest failed and the ration fell short, the temple extended grain loans. The loans carried interest. Interest in Mesopotamia this early is not a minor percentage. It is typically 20% per year on grain, 33% on silver. A family that borrowed in a drought year, intending to repay after the next harvest, could find that a second poor harvest doubled their debt before they had repaid the first. There are tablets recording debt bondage. A family member, often a child or a woman, handed over to the creditor as collateral for an unpaid loan. This is the element that most people do not carry when they imagine the world of the Ziggurats. They imagine ritual, grandeur, the power of a civilization that invented writing. They do not imagine a system that used divine authority to enforce financial obligations from which there was almost no legal exit. Debt forgiveness, Misharum in Akkadian, was occasionally declared by kings, wiping certain categories of debt clean. These declarations were considered acts of divine justice. They were also necessary precisely because the debt had accumulated to the point of systemic instability. You do not declare a debt jubilee in a world where no one is in debt. The god at the top of the Ziggurat did not create the debt. The system built in the god's name did. And the two things were indistinguishable from where you stood at the bottom. The law of this city is not separate from the temple. It flows from the same source of divine authority that blesses the harvest and records the ration. The most famous legal code from this region, the Code of Hammurabi, is presented not as human legislation, but as divine instruction, received from the sun god and inscribed in stone for all to see. The law is the god's will made administrative. For you, at the bottom of the hierarchy, this matters in very specific ways. The law recognizes you as a person with rights. You can bring a complaint before a court. You can own property. You can enter contracts. These are not trivial protections. They distinguish you from a slave, and slavery is legal and present in this world. But the law also recognizes the people above you as having greater rights by virtue of their class. Assault against a nobleman carries a heavier penalty than assault against a commoner. The fine system is calibrated to rank. More practically, the law governs debt. And debt, in this city, touches almost everything. If you default on a loan, the creditor can take your grain, your tools, your house. If you default repeatedly, you can be taken yourself, bound to service until the debt is repaid. Temple records show individuals in exactly this position, their labor essentially the property of an institution until an unpayable balance is settled. The legal term is debt servitude. The practical experience is indistinguishable from slavery except in legal category. There is no lawyer you can hire. There is no independent judiciary. The scribes who record your debt are trained in the same institutions that benefit from your repayment. When you appear before a judge, the judge is connected to the same administrative network that issued the original loan. The system is not corrupt. It is coherent. It was built this way, and its coherence is what makes it inescapable for anyone without wealth or connection at the level above you. Women in this city exist within a hierarchy that has a hierarchy inside it. Class matters more than gender in determining how much freedom you have, how much protection you receive, how much danger surrounds you daily. A woman of the temple elite, an Ontu priestess, a Naditu of the god Shamash, holds legal rights, manages property, enters commercial agreements, and occupies a recognized social position of considerable dignity. Her life is restricted in other ways: celibacy requirements, residence inside the temple complex, but she is not powerless. A woman in the common laboring class is a different matter. She is protected legally. Her husband cannot simply abandon her without paying compensation, and contracts of marriage define specific obligations on both sides. But her work is invisible in the records that survive. The ration tablets that document labor allocations show men's names in the majority. Women's labor, grain processing, textile production, food preparation, child rearing appears in the record only when it passes through the temple workshop system, where large groups of women worked in conditions that look, to modern eyes, like institutional labor for minimal return. Widows and women whose husbands have been taken into debt servitude occupy the most precarious position in this world. They fall outside the standard household unit that the ration system is designed to support. Temple records do show provisions for some categories of vulnerable women, rations for widows, allocations for women with children who cannot work. But these provisions are irregular and insufficient. Poverty in this world has a gendered face, And it is the face of a woman without male economic support trying to navigate a system that was not designed with her survival as a priority. When the household fails, it does not fail evenly. It fails from the outside in. And the outside is where the least protected already live. A city built on a floodplain survives until the river decides otherwise. The Tigris and Euphrates do not flood on a schedule. They flood when the snowmelt in distant mountains is heavy, when the spring rains do not stop, when the canals that are supposed to redirect the overflow are blocked with silt or damaged by the previous year's work. A flood year does not just damage crops, it damages the infrastructure that makes crops possible. Canal walls collapse, irrigation gates jam or wash away. Fields that took seasons to prepare are buried under silt or scoured to bedrock. But the flood is only the first domino. When the fields fail, the harvest fails. When the harvest fails, the temple granary begins to draw down reserves. Those reserves were calculated for a specific shortfall, the kind that happens once every few years. A second bad year in succession is not planned for. The ration system, which functions precisely because it is calibrated to the expected yield, begins to reduce allocations. First, the discretionary items, the oil, the occasional fish, then the barley itself, in smaller measures. The debt market fills the gap that the ration system creates. Families borrow to eat. The interest runs. If the third year is also bad, and in the archaeological record, multi-year droughts and flood cycles appear with regularity, the debt has compounded past the point where a normal harvest can repay it. At that stage, the social mechanisms that keep the city coherent begin to fray. People abandon outlying farms and move inside city walls. Population density increases in the residential quarters. The same contaminated water supply is now serving more bodies under more stress. Disease follows shortage as reliably as night follows day. The temple, during these cascades, does not disappear. It continues to function. It continues to collect what it can. It may issue a partial misharum, a debt amnesty for certain categories of debt. But the institutional machine does not pause. It adjusts. And in the space between what the institution needs and what the people can give, the people absorb the difference with their bodies. And yet, people stayed. Generation after generation, they stayed in the shadow of the Ziggurat, performed their labor, paid their rations, buried their children, and came back the next morning. This was not passivity. It was calculation. The walls of the city were real. The canals that the corvée labor maintained were real. In a landscape where nomadic raiders existed, where rival city-states competed for agricultural land, where an unirrigated field produced almost nothing, the managed misery of the temple system was genuinely preferable to the alternative. The alternative was not freedom, it was exposure. Resistance existed, but it was quiet and practical. Families underreported harvest yields. Laborers moved to the margins of the work quota rather than exceeding it. A debtor disappeared into a larger city where the records did not follow. Small acts of non-compliance that left no dramatic record, but that appear as gaps and inconsistencies in the administrative tablets. Numbers that don't quite add up. Names that vanish from the ration lists without explanation. The deepest resistance was communal. The residential quarters of these cities were not atomized individuals. They were extended family networks, neighborhood units, groups of people who shared water, food, child-rearing, and the specific knowledge of how to survive in this particular system. When a household fell into debt crisis, the people around it absorbed some of the impact, not through institutional charity, but through the informal economy of mutual obligation that ran parallel to the temple's formal economy and was never recorded in clay. Hope in this world was not the hope of progress. It was the hope of continuity. That the canal would hold through the planting season, that the ration would not fall again. that the child who was sick at dawn would be alive at dusk. When those things happened, it was enough. It was what surviving looked like. When we imagine the world of the Ziggurats, we tend to imagine grandeur, the towering terraces, the torchlit rituals at the summit, the priests in white linen, the cuneiform tablets recording the birth of writing, of law, of organized civilization. And all of that is real. It happened. The ziggurat was one of the most consequential architectural and social inventions in human history. But grandeur is a view from above. The view from below is different. From below, the ziggurat was the institution that measured your field, recorded your debt, assigned your labor, calculated your ration, and adjudicated your disputes through a legal system built to sustain itself. It was also the institution that kept you alive when nothing else could. The two things were not in contradiction. They were the same thing. The people who lived inside that system were not primitive, not mystified. They were people doing what people have always done, navigating a structure that was larger than them, finding the edges where they could breathe, and continuing. The ziggurat was not eternal. Every city that built one eventually fell, to drought, to conquest, to the slow erosion of administrative coherence. The structures that survived into the archaeological record are the ones the earth preserved. The people who built them are preserved only in the aggregate, in bone and tablet and canal wall. They did not leave names. They left systems. And the systems worked until they didn't. If you had been born in the shadow of a ziggurat 4,000 years ago, which part of the system do you think would have broken you first? The labor quota, the debt, or the water? Leave your answer in the comments. If this kind of immersive historical reconstruction is what you come here for, subscribe. Every video is built to put you inside a world that most people only see from the outside. The next place we're going may be even harder to survive.